What's up, Canadian Insights crew? So, David Eby just walked into a federal meeting and basically said, "Hey Ottawa, you know that highway that carries 90% of our trade? Yeah, it floods now. Fix it or Saskatchewan's going to keep shipping through Washington like we don't even exist." And honestly, when a premier has to guilt-trip the feds using potash routes, you know infrastructure talks are getting spicy. Let's break down why BC's premier is essentially begging Ottawa to remember that the West Coast exists and why one flooded highway could tank Canada's entire supply chain. Picture this. You're hosting a massive dinner party, right? Your kitchen is the only way food gets from the stove to the table. Now imagine that kitchen floods every time it rains hard, but instead of fixing the floor, everyone just stands around going, "Wow, that's wet." That's basically Highway 1 through BC's Fraser Valley, except instead of dinner, we're talking billions of dollars in trade, and instead of hungry guests, we've got truckers, commuters, and international shipping companies wondering if Canada's even a reliable trade partner anymore. Welcome to infrastructure politics, where the stakes are high and the pavement is apparently optional. David Eby met with the federal government's major projects office on Wednesday, and let me tell you, he came loaded. He's raising the alarm about what he calls trade-enabling infrastructure, which is government speak for the roads, tunnels, and routes that actually make the economy function. We're talking Highway 1 through the Fraser Valley and the Massey Tunnel, which is this critical bottleneck that funnels commuters and commercial trucks to coastal ports. If you've ever been stuck in Massey Tunnel traffic, you know it's already a nightmare. Now add flooding to the mix, and you've got yourself a logistical disaster with a side of economic chaos. Here's the kicker. Days before this meeting, major flooding closed stretches of Highway 1. Again. Because apparently, Mother Nature looked at BC's infrastructure and said, "You know what this needs? More water." Eby's saying work needs to be done now to protect the area because if they don't, that highway could face impacts lasting months. Not days. Months. Imagine months of disrupted trade across the entire country because one highway couldn't handle a rainstorm. It's like if your Wi-Fi went down and suddenly nobody in the house could work, stream, or function. Except instead of your house, it's the national economy. And this isn't just theoretical doom and gloom. Eby pointed to a real-world consequence that's already happening. Nutrien, a Saskatchewan-based company that ships potash, recently decided to route their products through Washington state instead of BC ports. Let that sink in. A Canadian company is bypassing Canadian infrastructure because it's more reliable to ship through the United States. That's not just embarrassing, that's a flashing neon sign that says, our infrastructure can't handle the job. If companies start looking south because our roads keep flooding, we're not just losing revenue, we're losing our reputation as a functional trading nation. Now let's talk about what's actually at risk here, because it's not just one highway. Abbotsford Mayor Ross Siemens jumped into the conversation on Friday, making it crystal clear that without federal investment in flood mitigation, both the provincial and national economies remain unprotected and at risk. Siemens isn't being dramatic. Highway 1 isn't just asphalt. Underneath and alongside it, you've got a gas pipeline and fiber optic infrastructure serving the entire region. So when Eby talks about an uncontrolled release of water from Washington state, he's not just worried about wet roads. He's worried about ruptured pipelines, severed communications, and a cascade of failures that would make a disaster movie look tame. Speaking of Washington, let's address the international frenemy situation. The Nooksack River, which sits along the border in Washington state, burst its banks during last week's storms and sent water flooding north into BC's Fraser Valley. Homes flooded. Farmland flooded. And BC's sitting there going, cool, so we're just at the mercy of a river in another country now. It's a mess, and it highlights how interconnected and vulnerable this region is. You can't just build a wall against water. You need coordinated flood mitigation, cross-border cooperation, and serious federal investment. Hence, Eby's plea for Ottawa to get to the table. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Siemens said Highway 1 flood mitigation should be elevated to the status of a nation-building project. Nation-building. That's the kind of language usually reserved for transcontinental railways and mega dams. But he's right. Highway 1 isn't just a local road. It's the Asia-Pacific gateway. It's a key trade corridor. 90,000 vehicles travel through Abbotsford on that highway every single day. That's commuters, that's freight, that's food security, that's supply chain resilience. If that highway goes down for an extended period, the ripple effects hit the entire country. Eby's got a meeting coming up with Prime Minister Mark Carney this week, along with other premiers, and you better believe he's bringing receipts. He's planning to raise the issue of transportation infrastructure and make it clear that if the federal government wants to increase exports through BC ports, they need to stop treating the roads leading to those ports like an afterthought. And then, because Eby's got a flair for the dramatic, he dropped this absolute zinger: if they have $60 billion to take an hour off the train ride between Montreal and Ottawa, then I am sure we can reach agreement on moving goods and people around British Columbia without difficulty. Ouch. That's a direct shot at the high-frequency rail project in central Canada, and honestly, fair. BC's not asking for a luxury express train. They're asking for roads that don't turn into rivers. Now, Ottawa's not completely ignoring BC. 4 BC projects made it onto the federal government's list of nation-building projects coming out of the Major Projects Office. We've got LNG Canada Phase 2 in Kitimat, the expansion of the Red Chris mine, the North Coast Transmission Line, and KSI Leasims, a proposed floating natural gas facility. Those are big deals, economically significant, and they show that Ottawa's paying some attention. But here's the thing: you can greenlight all the LNG and mining projects you want, but if you can't get the product out because the highway's underwater, what's the point? It's like buying a sports car and parking it in a garage with no door. Sure, it looks great, but it's not going anywhere. The frustration from BC is palpable, and it's not hard to see why. The province is sitting on the Pacific Gateway to Asia, one of the most economically strategic positions in the country, and they're watching their critical infrastructure buckle under climate pressures while the feds debate high-speed rail in Ontario and Quebec. It feels like being the kid in the back of the class waving your hand desperately while the teacher calls on the front row. Again. But Eby's optimistic, or at least is projecting optimism. He says he's convinced these issues can be dealt with, but it'll require attention, focus, and a real push from the federal government. That's diplomatic speak for get your act together, Ottawa, because we're drowning out here, literally. The bottlenecks are real. The risks are real. And if Canada wants to be taken seriously as a trading nation, we need infrastructure that works in all weather, not just on sunny days. So here's where we land. BC's Premier is sounding the alarm, the Mayor of Abbotsford's backing him up, and the message to Ottawa is clear: invest in flood mitigation and transportation infrastructure, or watch companies ship through the states while Canadian trade corridors crumble. It's not a sexy issue. Nobody's making TikToks about highway drainage systems. But it matters, maybe more than almost anything else on the political agenda right now. Alright, Canada watchers, that's the situation. Eby versus the floodwaters, with Ottawa somewhere in the middle deciding whether BC infrastructure is worth the investment. What do you think? Should Highway 1 be a nation-building priority, or is BC overreacting? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And hey, if you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that button because Canadian Insights is dropping multiple videos today and you don't want to miss what's next.